Hello, good afternoon. I'm Karen McCormick from Berengia. We are a US and UK venture capital firm investing primarily in and around Series A. And I've got with me today Tanya, founder of IoT Tribe, and Matthew of Cyclum. I hope I'm saying that right, Matthew. I'll start by asking both Tanya and Matthew to introduce themselves. And today we're basically going to be talking about what it takes to build and scale a company with regards to the tech stack and the tech product. So Tanya, can I start with you? Would you mind doing a quick intro of yourself?
Sure, Karen, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be with you here today. And Matt, also nice to meet you. IoT Tribe, we're essentially an equity-free ecosystem builder. We're headquartered in the UK, but we have operations globally. We have offices in Singapore, and we also operate out of Europe. Our acceleration programs are at the core of what we do. And from there, we build out relationships with the startups, the scale-ups, the founders, but also with the research community across different domains. And I think the final thing I'd like to say is that we're super collaborative, and we're also really welcoming in terms of the different types of technologies that we bring on board, in spite of the name being IoT Tribe.
That's great. Thank you very much. And Matt, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and Cyclum?
Absolutely, sure. Yeah, thank you for inviting me and being here with you guys today. I think, yes, my background is management consulting into IT services with EY and IBM, and then I'm now the UK managing director of Cyclum. We're a product engineering company that also kind of supports around the consulting and the product management side. And in essence, I guess we've worked with the likes of Payoneer, eToro to go from essentially a startup to an IPO. And at the same time, we work with some of the kind of significant companies like kind of TUI and Just Eat. We'll do everything, I guess, from product management to design to building the tech stack. But always, I think, our view is we're there to support our customers and clients to build something. They bring the kind of vision and the idea, and we're there to help them create IP and new kind of technology that changes industries or changes the way people live.
That's great. Thank you. Good. So today we're talking about basically how do you get from an MVP to IPO? When you're talking about a technology product, where do you start with from an MPV? And Tanya, given you're part of an accelerator or an incubator, and Matt, given you basically develop products for startups and larger companies, I think you'll both be pretty well placed to answer this. But how do you think about starting from MVP and going to product? So you've got a founder that either has an initial idea or something slightly commercialized. Where do you start? And do you start at your MVP thinking about the actual road to IPO, and do you actually try and plan that out, or is it more about just wing it, try something, get there with a bit of hamster wheels and sticky tape and see how it goes? Tanya, can I start with you?
Yeah, sure. So the first thing is that I wouldn't start with the technology at all. You start with the problem, right? With the problem you're trying to solve. I think that everyone has heard this to the death. But it's still true that if you're an engineer, you probably actually do start with the technology, and then you have to go through a whole process of finding a market for that technology. So one thing is the theories on the one hand, and then what happens in practice is something completely different. And similarly with deep tech and very heavy research-centered products and businesses that can be built out of that research. So it's not necessarily a recipe for failure or success to start with one or the other. The second thing that I would like to say is that within IoT Tribe, we always deal with products that are already there. We don't deal with MVPs. So we deal with products that have at least some evidence of product market fit. And what that means can really vary. It means that they can have some customers, but it might also just mean that they've got some initial deployments that have been validated through maybe some initial grants from Innovate UK or other international research agencies. But there's something there that really does indicate that market demand is there and that potential is there. Now, your question refers to at what point do you actually think about the IPO? I think that has to happen really early on in the process, but probably only after you've proven that there is a market for what you do, and that you can deliver at least a certain scale. So if you're dealing with artificial intelligence or a sensor-based product, you still need to be able to prove that you're going to be able to scale that solution to incorporate different data sets, and that can operate legally across several jurisdictions. If it is hardware that you're talking about, there are all sorts of protocols that you need to make sure that you're adhering to. But the funny thing is that most of those things, by the time that you're kind of ready for an IPO, if you then start to think about them, it's too late. You need to incorporate those considerations really on in your design, and that is where, you know, the customer discovery is absolutely not about marketing. It's not about whether your customer wants something blue or black or yellow or what you want to call it. It's about, you know, what are the limitations and the obstacles that might come up if your customer wanted to deploy this into 200,000 different scenarios.
Yep. Okay. Matt, what do you think? Do you agree?
Yeah, well, I think, I guess, how do you start first? I think, you know, I'm a seed investor in a couple of startups who are on their second iteration and got it wrong the first time. So I think there's probably a recognition that you may not get it right the first time. But one of the key things when you start is I think you need great founders. You need people who have, I guess, the wherewithal and the resilience. And the skills to build a company, because an IPO in our experience can take 5, 6, 7 years, right? So if you take the journey we've had with the likes of eToro, Payoneer, that doesn't happen in a year or two. So it is a long journey. I think the way I would start it is you do need that sort of view on an unmet need or an idea that you think you can make a difference. It's going to change the way people live, or it's going to change an industry. I think it depends on the nature of the business model. So there are many businesses which will start profitable. You know, some of the kind of online goods, vintage goods examples, and that's less about the tech and more about actually building out a customer audience. You can do that with quite light touch technology. There's lots of good open source, kind of fairly light software out there where you can make a lot of progress as a business. But if you're a pure software business model and you really, you know, you're probably not going to make a profit for 2 or 3 years, you do have to be starting with some fairly significant investment and at least looking at, you know, 1 or 2 teams, 10 or 20 people, and that is not cheap. So I think that, you know, the different companies go through different sort of journeys, and to do that you need to have the right capital investment and the right backers. A lot of these startups fail because they run out of funding. And I think if you are a software heavy business model, that you have to take that very seriously. What I would say, I guess the other key thought on how do you start, usually we would think about some sort of discovery or kind of process where you not necessarily plan out your route to IPO, but you have a view on a roadmap and some things that you want to do and some OKRs that you can use to measure that. And therefore you can find out if you're succeeding or failing and change direction. But some degree of framework or setting out a bit of a roadmap at the start is important. Do you plan for IPO? I don't know, probably our experiences, most of the people we've worked with who've IPO didn't necessarily plan to IPO. They had a passion and an idea. But I certainly think if your product scales, you know, after year 2, 3, at that point when you realize it's realistic, you have to, you know, exactly as we've just discussed, you have to start planning for all of those scalability, security, localization, all of that has to come into your thinking about technology and might lead to some significant replatforming or rebuild. So I would say 2, 3 years in, if you think you're going to succeed, that's when you really start to plan for an IPO scenario. I don't know, that would be my thoughts.
Yeah, I've got a bazillion questions coming out of all this, and I'm struggling to write them down. But sorry, Tanya, go ahead, please.
No, I was just going to say, I think that the the really interesting thing is that a few years ago, startups that wanted to IPO would have to go to really expensive advisors and shell out a lot of money to get hold of expertise that would enable them to plan properly and to leave not to leave too much money on the table when it came to all the fundraising that comes prior to the IPO. The London Stock Exchange now, for example, has a program in which they provide a lot of that initial advice. And you can really access a lot of expertise to understand what you need to do, at what stage you need to do it, what the key metrics that might help you understand whether IPO is an option for you or not. And I think that that is something that anyone who's even thinking about IPO should absolutely avail themselves of.
That's great. And how would people access that, Tanya? Is there a website?
Well, we've got contacts within the LSEG and Refinitiv specifically, so they've got a kind of acceleration program that is very complementary to ours, in which but there are also a number of other organizations that do that for stock exchanges globally. So yeah, if anyone wants any further information, happy to help.
Great, thank you. Matt, I'm going to go back to a couple of things you mentioned, and it ties in with what Tanya was talking about. When you talked about kind of the product roadmap, so you talked about OKRs with relation to either the product or the MPV, and then you talked about kind of when do you need to re-platform or scrap something. And I just want to, I'd love a little bit more insight into how do you think about that product roadmap? Do you need to be ahead of it and be thinking about, I need to release a new product every X months that's going to cannibalize what I did before and plan on full replatforming every 3 years? Or is it more reactionary where you feel like this is just getting a bit stale? And I mean, if you think about the product that Uber had with their MVP, I'm sure it resembles nothing to the product that we all use every day. And even our portfolio company, Monica Veneta, which is a jewelry company. I mean, I remember their initial website we thought was phenomenal when they launched it a couple of years ago. It was like, oh my gosh, this is a million times better. And now they're just so much better than that. And I'm not sure we could have envisaged exactly what it was going to look like today, 5 or 6 years ago. But how do you think about that testing, learning, and re-releasing? And do you plan for it or react to it? And Matt, I'll start with you and then come back to Tanya.
Yeah, and again, you know, if the company is a reasonably heavy technology product to begin with, then there are some really basic principles. You know, really these days you should be looking to be building on the cloud, kind of cloud native mindset, because then you a lot of accelerators that come with that, you know, that type of infrastructure that mean it avoids kind of rework and makes things easier to change and evolve. I think the other thing is you think about some good architectural disciplines. So you build in components. Some people call it microservices, but you build with the view that you might change things or switch things out later. And I guess there are, you know, one of the challenges, you can never really stand still with this stuff. Technology moves so fast, whether it's some of the exponential technologies that are a bit more R&D focused or some of the more basic stuff. So I think you always have to have that mindset that what you build is going to change, but there are modern frameworks out there you can use. But so there are some basic principles, but there's also a lot of fairly reusable kind of open source or light touch technology that until you're confident about what you're building, you try and build with the lowest possible cost of ownership and the lowest possible cost of replacement.
Examples of what these could be. So if a founder's watching this thinking, where do I go to do this, or what should I explore? Where can they go?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, there are lots of open source communities. There is plenty of other kind of, I guess, research and analysts, whether it's, you know, Gartner or others that have views on the different areas. Certainly when it comes to digital and online, and there is an outrageous number of MarTech kind of tools and enablers out there. So I
basically start with Google research.
Yeah, I think so. And the other, you know, the other side of it, I guess, is what's important. You're always going to probably have, depending on the nature of the business, you want to be looking for some sort of CRM or some sort of data capability quite early on that you can use. But so those would be the basic principles I would think about, you know, so that you avoid as much kind of rework and rebuild as possible.
Okay, I like the idea of the kind of almost plug and play componentry there. And Tanya, How do you guys advise companies to think about their road mapping?
So I'm totally concur there with Matt in terms of the architecture. So you need to have an architecture that is specific enough that you know what you need to build and how it integrates into the different layers of what your technology stack is. But it needs to have sufficient flexibility to allow for technologies that maybe are not available now, but will be available in the near future or even in the longer term future. How do you gaze into that crystal ball? Well, my recommendation would be to absolutely join industry bodies. You know, I'm a governing board member for the Quantum Industry Consortium, and it's an amazing ecosystem. There's so much information on the technologies that will be available online, but not just on the technological side of things, but also how they might be deployed in industry. And all of that will give founders really interesting insights into what they need to allow for in the future. And similarly with the Alliance for Internet of Things Innovation, there's a lot of information around architectures. So you definitely don't need to just sit there in front of a blank screen and start typing away and use whatever program you want to use to design something from scratch. There's a lot of good practice out there. There's a lot of knowledge that you should absolutely tap into. Some of that will be available through Google search, but I think that the richest source of knowledge is always through personal contact, and for that you need networks. And COVID has had an impact on the ability to have those conversations on a one-to-one basis. So if you attend an event, it's normally in a group of, well, you know, I was moderating a panel the day before yesterday in London, and it was fantastic to have people in the room and having those conversations as a group, but also then just wanted to check on this because they wanted to ask something that was a little bit more specific on, in this case, it was, Matt referred to cloud native. Well, what about, fog computing, swarm computing? If you're operating multiple devices, how about allowing for some far edge computing as well on those devices and in the field? So all of those conversations you might not necessarily want to have on an open environment. You want to have them individually, but whatever you can, attend and however you can ask the questions, then again, curiosity is definitely the first step to success. And keeping that curiosity, regardless of the size of your company.
Great.
And just to build on that from the road mapping perspective, I think there is some fairly basic questions we often think about it. What is going to be your core intellectual property, or what's the real heart of your business? And that is the sort of stuff you should look to build custom, and you own the IP, and it's what gives you a competitive advantage. And that's particularly where you should measure your outcomes or OKRs. But your roadmap, whether you use the analogous innovation type techniques of looking over the garden fence at other industries or talking to other people, or you just have a passion and a vision for what you're trying to build, that's where you should focus those measurements, and that's where you should focus your investment on what builds competitive advantage. And I think the roadmap helps you to keep true to that. But that for us, a lot of our work is building out that custom technology and building it so that people own it and they can make money from it. But that's a good rule of thumb.
Yeah, it's a good learning. The idea that what your core is and what you're good at is what you should spend your money developing yourself. Matt, I just have to ask, that idea of developing it yourself, how does that play with hire somebody to develop it for me? Because that's basically what you do, right? Should a company own that team? And how do you think about what does a product team look like? So when you finish your work, for example, what's a good product team versus what would fail? What would you say is a bad idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, first and foremost, whether you employ people and do it yourself, or you work with a partner, or a bit of both, this concept of kind of multidisciplinary teams and the right ways of working is really important. So if you have the business talking to the product team and providing them with the right content, then they're going to build you the right things, and that takes quite a lot of effort to get right. And the ways of working and the engineering techniques you use to do that are really important. But if you do achieve that, you can get a kind of velocity, which means you can innovate at pace and sort of fail and learn. But that is about multidisciplinary and really good engineering practices, whether it's CI/CD or whatever. But I can't stress how important it is to invest in getting a team up to speed. And that might delay your MVP 6 weeks, but it's so important from my perspective.
Do you have a view? I mean, Chief Product Officer has become a relatively popularized title. We certainly have plenty of them across our portfolio, but there's also some overlap with this traditional CTO role. I guess, how do you think about, should companies have a Chief Product Officer? How do they interact with a tech team, or are they effectively the same team? Tanya, could I throw that one to you?
I think that essentially that would depend on the size of the company. If you can afford to have a product officer that is purely focused on one product, then, that's an absolute luxury. They don't have to, be pulled from pillar to post and take into consideration, the peripherals of what they're trying to build. As Matt has just said, they can make sure that if they are pulling on external resources, they can guide those external resources to exactly the outcome they want delivered in the time frame they want delivered. I think a CTO is a wider role, and overarching, a CTO essentially might be responsible for more than one product. And many companies will, if you take, for example, a company that's recently successfully IPO'd, UiPath, they started in Romania, I think it was 2005. The first 10 years, they were still a relatively small company. For the first, I don't know how many years, their turnover was $1 million. They IPO'd, I think it was last year, on the New York Stock Exchange for 1.3 billion, which isn't bad. And it's all about process optimization and robotics. And they came into their own. They definitely had a good product to begin with, but it was essentially the advent of the pandemic and the need for increased automation and enabling large companies to not rely on having everyone at a single site and be able to manage them, site scene and through product lines. That's what really gave them the boost to really develop their products and expand their product range, and to obviously to be able to IPO with that in mind. But yeah.
And I think there's a couple of sort of good indirect lessons in that as well. I think your question about should you build the talent in-house or out of house is, at the moment, I think, there is lots of great talent in countries like Romania and other locations that realistically you have to be open-minded to consider multiple geographies. And I think, part of that as well is just there is a real demand right now for technology skills. I would probably say that demand outstrips supply. So you probably do have to be thinking about partnering with someone just to help you manage that talent gap and the ability to recruit talent, particularly as a startup. When you're in the MVP phase, you probably haven't built those organizational muscles yet to recruit and compete. However, what I would say is you need enough technology and product leadership in your company to create a healthy tension. Otherwise, I think it just won't work. And those, call them what we like, they are two kind of different roles. I think somebody has to care about the consumer or the product and fight for that, and somebody has to have enough technology knowledge to fight for something that's scalable and secure. And so I think those two roles, however they manifest themselves, or however kind of senior or expensive those people are, need to probably exist within the business. And then after that, I think these days you probably do have to be partnering with somebody for at least some of the team.
Yep. Okay. And just down that path, and then I'm going to switch gears and ask about OKRs again, but continuing down the team path. So, I mean, I think a lot of early stage companies offshored some of their technical resources for a while now. But I think the pandemic has, for a lot of people, accelerated the idea that it doesn't really matter where the team is. If you're an early stage founder looking to find, a cost-effective team somewhere, how do you go about doing it? And I can speak from our own portfolio. I think quite a few of them talked to other entrepreneurs and then just borrowed the team or borrowed the company that they were using, often in Eastern Europe, but it could be in different locations. India is a common one as well. I mean, how do you go about finding these developers and then getting comfortable with them, or doing any diligence on them to get comfortable? Matt, maybe I'd start with you, because you're one of the people that someone would go to.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, look, I mean, there is a wide range of companies that do it. I think sometimes there are cultural elements. So depending, there were, certain modest clothing companies that we may work with where you look that it might be beneficial for you to use, a location like Pakistan, or there are certain times where an Eastern European culture really fits well. So there's a kind of cultural alignment question with your organization now, or how you see it. But actually, I think, I would talk to other sort of startups and other people to get recommendations. I think word of mouth is always a great indication of whether a company is a good partner. If not, there are, I think the likes of Forrester and so on release various kind of information on lists of companies, or you just research on the local development websites in any given country. But there is lots of choice out there. So I think word of mouth, or also I guess we work with London and Partners, who I believe sponsor part of this event to help with their innovation ecosystem. Through networks, Tanya is member of a number of networks. You can often get recommendations through ecosystem partners who will say, look, I think I've worked with that company. They're different to me, but I think they're good.
Great. And Tanya, how do you advise companies on this?
So there are two routes. So we have a super active Slack channel. We've got over 400 companies that have come through MIT Tribe at one stage or another. So the most direct route is when they kind of put on Slack, who knows of, and somebody comes back with an answer. But that's never a substitute for doing due diligence, because UK rules, for example, on your responsibilities to ensure that you are compliant with modern slavery, all of these regulations that are there to essentially make sure that everything is done correctly and according to, the laws of the land, as it were, but also our moral obligation to ensure that's the case. That always has to happen. You can't rely on somebody else telling you, oh yeah, this is a great company, they're going to do a great job. Well, yes, they may be doing a great job, but it might be that their carbon footprint is absolutely horrendous. And that's something that if you do IPO, by the way, you're going to have to report on. So it's not just about taking the cheapest offer or the quickest offer, or the people that have worked with your colleagues or fellow members in your cohort in the past. You have to kind of think ahead and look at that compliance piece as well.
Yep.
And I think there's an interesting point there. You do have to think about who can you scale with, whether it's global reach or, like you say, someone who's compliant with the needs of a large company going through an IPO. I think partnering with someone who can go on the journey with you, I think, is important. We've certainly had long tenure with a lot of our clients, and I think we've both found that much more beneficial than having to chop and change partway through your journey.
Okay. That's great. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and go back to the OKRs idea, and this journey from MVP to IPO. Obviously, if you're getting to the stage where you're contemplating an IPO, you've probably been pretty successful, and some of these questions might not apply. But at the earlier stages, or as you're developing the product and thinking about either new releases or new versions or new products, how do you judge success? And flip side is, how do you judge failure? And I can speak from experience. Founders need to be almost pathologically optimistic, otherwise you'd never found a company, and therefore there's an inherent allergy to admitting failure at times, and it even bleeds into people like me, the investors, who believe so much in something that we don't want to see it fail. When do you actually call it quits, and how do you measure that? Or maybe not call it quits, but say this just isn't working, we need to go back to the drawing board. Matt, can I start with you on that one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, a lot of the companies we work through early stages, as I'm sure you're familiar with, go through various fundraising stages. So there's some natural governance and controls there that they've got to justify to somebody else why they should give them some money. So I think, and in order to do that, a lot of the people who, whether they're angel investors or private equity or venture capital, are super smart people. So I think in order to do that, whether you call it an OKR or a business case, you need to be able to express what you're trying to achieve. So what is the improvement in a customer's journey? What is the improvement in a product? And to some extent measure that. So I think there are natural hedges there in fundraising, which are healthy and stop you going too far down the wrong path. But the other side is it is a little bit about that product vision and that roadmap. So can you confidently, as Tanya said, demonstrate, even if it's a small amount of evidence, that there is a product market fit, that people want it, and what data have you got to prove that? And that's what a little bit the OKR about is, very early on in any product's life, there is a way of measuring something, whether it's customer feedback or it's, the number of people who click on a page or where they click, So I think that data-driven mentality, I know it's a bit of a cliche, but I think that's really important. And the sooner you can measure something, and the sooner you're measuring customer perspective, the sooner you will realize that yourself, irrespective of somebody, calling you up on the next raise at some point on the journey.
Yep. And Tanya, are there any OKRs specifically that you guys commonly would ask for people to be producing or encourage them to do?
Yeah, there's definitely the repeat customer, right? So yes, you've got all these beautiful logos on your deck. How many of those are real customers, opposed to you've joined their acceleration program, or they've given you some freebies that you've then kind of put into your product, and then you say they're a customer? That's kind of like a little bit you're just kidding yourself, right? You're lying to yourself. And I do agree with you. I think, as a founder, of course you're optimistic, and also you fake it till you make it. You don't go out to your first meeting saying, I don't know what I'm doing, can you help me? You go out with the absolute conviction that what you're doing is needed and you're going to change the world, and you're the best thing, to use a cliche, since sliced bread, or whatever the more modern phrase for that is. But for me, there's definitely one metric. Are your initial customers still with you? If not, why not? Maybe your product is it's got too sophisticated, and you need to move up. So if you were initially working with startups and SMEs, maybe you do need to adjust that and go and work with to be able to offer that same product to corporates, and the pricing changes, etc., etc. That's a fairly legitimate reason, right? But either way, your second round of customers, if you're continuously looking for excuses for why your customers are not re-engaging with you, for me that's a super easy metric to kind of like measure, and that tells you you're in the wrong market, or you've got the wrong product at this particular point in time.
Yep. Okay. Are there easy ways to tell? And I guess repeat is one of the easiest, but are there any ways to tell if a product is a need to have versus a nice to have? And one of the things that we're finding in evaluating opportunities, there are a lot of really young companies raising right now because they've had great early traction, but they haven't been around long enough to either have much in terms of repeat or client renewals. And so we have to think more creatively about how do we test whether this is a need to have or nice to have. But are there any things you guys would look out for other than just, repeats or renewals to understand whether it's a need to have product?
So Matt, if I can maybe just jump in there with something really simple. I'm not sure TikTok is a need to have, but it's the most valuable. Part of the most valuable. It's the most. It's ByteDance, right? It's the most valued company in the whole world. It is, it's got the biggest valuation. The iPhone, again, that's a nice to have. Quite frankly, you could have a Xiaomi that does the same thing, but people still buy iPhones. So I'm not sure that particular metric is useful for a business. What might be a better question is, what part of your product is a nice to have as opposed to a need to have? And that's where you can really save yourself a lot of headaches in terms of product development, going to market, testing. Matt, I'm sure you've seen that a lot.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, sometimes there's, certain trends, whether it be car platforms or payment platforms, where it is undeniable right now that there is a huge amount of growth and new companies emerging every day that either IPO or make a lot of money. So where you see certain, dealership model being disrupted or payment services being needed for online commerce, and it's undeniable that that's an area of value that you can exploit if you can build something right. Where it's a little bit more experimental and I guess kind of innovative, I think it becomes a bit harder. But as Tanya said, there are a number of measures, whether it's habit forming, so do people use it and reuse it, kind of the TikTok analogy. Do you, and then this is incredibly hard to measure, but you create an emotional connection, so the brand element, you know, do people, you know, warm to it? Is it something they value? So I think that's much harder to know, and I think some of it is the conviction from the founder, and some of it is the continuing measurement. But what is really important is if you do something and then you want to test a hypothesis, you then change something and make sure you measure what moved. So I think it's not simply about drawing a line at any one time. It's about observing trends in those OKRs and those behaviors from your consumer over time. And that's often what teaches you more than kind of, just looking at your revenue number or your number of customers, at a point in time.
Yep. Okay, great. I'm going to ask a little bit about kind of how decisions get made within companies. And if you've got any examples, I'd always love those. But in my own experience, a company's kind of DNA or center of gravity with decision making is often driven by kind of the founder's background and interests. So the founder might be a technologist or a product advocate or a brand advocate, but generally one of product, brand, or commercial makes the ultimate decisions. And there's the kind of age-old problem that every company has had where, you've got a development house based in UK, and then you've got your sales team in the US, and they come back and say, great news, I just sold this massive contract. We just need a couple tweaks to the product. And then the product team or the tech team has a heart attack about what they've been committed to do. How do you see that? I mean, do you think that that's true, that companies are generally led by one of either product, brand, or commercial? And how do you see decisions getting made? And is there a best practice on that front? And Tanya, can I start with you on that?
I've seen that problem not so much in the startups and the scale ups. I've seen it more in the corporates. So yeah. It's typically when the sales team is not aligned with product development. I mean, this happens in all large companies. It's a perennial problem. So I don't think it's up to startups to solve or for scale ups to solve. You just have to accept, I suppose, that at some stage you need to make sure that your mechanisms, the mechanisms that you have internally for your sales and product development teams to be continuously talking and to understand what is possible. And in larger companies, you also have this, for example, with end of line, right? So, okay, so we've got a client, we've been working with them for 20 years, and we are going to renew our products, and therefore the service, the support that we're going to provide for the previous version is going to fizzle out. What does that do to my relationship with my client, who, I sold him this device 2 years ago, and now I'm telling him, oh, by the way, you've got to phase that out, or we're going to phase out the support over the next 3 months. There are all sorts of business really relevant questions that have to do with how you structure your business. And I think that normally the problems arise when there isn't enough communication between all of those. The brand, and brand is about reputation. It's not about whether you've got a nice logo that's going to be around and valued at whatever in 100 years' time. It's also about your reputation. And yeah.
Yeah, I'd sort of build on that. I'd say there's some kind of simple but really kind of useful things you can do. So I think you've got to blend your cap table. So you create ideally a blend of investors or experts or people who know you well, so that you get some different inputs, and that governance inherently kind of helps to manage a startup, particularly a startup, because they're probably not going to have a lot of organizational governance and controls in the way that a big company will have. So creating some tension in the mix around a blended cap table helps. I think I would absolutely agree with Tanya that because the space between the founders and the product team is generally quite small in a startup, and also it's in their DNA to build product often, so it comes more natural. You have less of those behaviors, but I do agree, a lot of the large enterprise organizations we work with have not come from a product mindset, and I think anyone that isn't are now really seriously considering how do they build proper product organizations so they can be more nimble and they can create more IP to keep pace with the startups and the scale-ups. I mean, Tanya, you referred to some IPO figures, but it's pretty scary, the amount of investment and the amount of kind of IPO valuations that are emerging every day. So it's a really interesting competitive environment at the moment.
Yeah, I'm gonna I'll throw my 2 cents in on this just from some things I've seen from the outside. But in the meantime, I'll give you a minute to think about my last question, which is going to be, could I have an example of something that you think, or someone you think is doing this great? So either a company that you feel has nailed it in terms of the way they manage product, or even a sector or geography that's kind of ahead of the times. So I'll come back to you on that in a second, but just in terms of this idea between what a customer wants or what the sales team sold and what product development is willing to do. I think I understand your point, Tanya, that it happens in large corporates all the time, but we do find it happens with some of the startups, mainly ones that are in enterprise software. And I've got 2 examples. Neither of them are companies still in our portfolio, but we had one company in the past that had a product that was doing all right. Contract values were probably sub 100,000, but they had some pretty good names and they had some renewals. And they were doing all right. And they had a massive US customer who said, we don't want that, but we would like this if you can do this. And it was just too much money to say no to. So the company agreed to do it. And it was all the painful things you would think of, like huge distraction, lots of resource sucked in. We kind of had a sales impact because no one was able to kind of sell and service the other side. However, at the end of it, what we had was a much better killer product that they then commercialized and did much better out of. And then I've got an example of almost the reverse, where exact same scenario. Company had some pretty good customers, some pretty good contract values. Massive US customer said, we don't want that, but we would like this. Company developed this for them, but it turned out to be much more of a company specific product. And that blue chip company in the US said, oh, that was really good. You guys did a good job. Now could you go develop this for us? And within a couple of years, the business ended up being effectively a job shop for this one large corporate. And then they had this long tail of customers with small contracts for the original project. So I would say in one case, it created a lot of value. In another case, it was really pretty value destructive. Like, while we had a lot of revenue, it was not what we set out to do, nor was it particularly repeatable. But anyway, I'll come back to the question I was going to ask now. I'd love an example, and Matt, I'll pick on you first. If you can name a client, that's ideal. But if you could talk about a sector or geography, who's doing this really well, and why do you think they're doing it ahead of the curve?
In terms of the kind of product creation,
being on top of products, so product creation, development, kind of leading the charge in terms of how you go about doing this right.
Yeah, sure. So I think, I mean, I probably might give one traditional, one new. You know, this company is not a client, but is quite a traditional business that maybe, you know, also has some degree of financial constraint. But you know, BBC Sport and some of the innovation they've done without the funding and the private funding, they've created a great match of content and product. Whether you look in quite a habit forming app that they have that a lot of people will use when they want to balance something they trust from a story perspective and a content perspective. And then there's huge competition out there with other apps, and you wouldn't think of them as a traditional product organization, but they've always been fairly innovative, whether it's the red button or it's you know, moving into apps. So I think I find that a really great app that I think balances content, community, and is very habit forming. And from a traditional company, I think that's quite a nice example. I think, you know, I guess, you know, a couple of our clients that I would have to sort of refer to would be eToro, to democratize trading in the way that they have, irrespective of, you know, if everyone's got an opinion about the absolute, you know, perfection or otherwise of the usability of an app. But, you know, people now trade in a way that they just never used to and never would have if it wasn't for something like that.
Right. And yeah.
So I think in terms of sector, for me, it would have to be the mobility sector. So everyone from, you know, even large automotive, the traditional automotive companies, because of the challenges around net zero, decarbonisation and climate change, most of them have products. They've completely changed their product line, what our cars are going to look like. I mean, it's changing now, but in a few years' time, there are already a number of European countries that said, forget no diesel, and in fact no petrol either, depending on where you are. So that mix of kind of social imperative, but also regulation, and the ability of the company itself to adjust to all of that in a very short space of time, I think is nothing short of astounding. But in terms of if I want to look at some of the, I mean, they're not going to like me very much if I just pick them out, because as I say, we've got over 300 companies in the IT tribe, but just two that I have I've had a lot of interaction recently. So Talonsoft, they're a Singaporean company. They're now expanding into the UK. They've got huge brand names as customers, and what they enable is essentially smart factories. So they enable virtualization of any environment with no code required. So they don't have to, if you own a factory or even a number of factories, you don't have to know have any AI skills or any data science skills to be able to develop something that shows you exactly what's happening in your factory or factories across the world. And the fact that they've just done a huge deployment for Foxconn, I think it was, with over 500,000 different sensors. So for me, that they're a really good example of having one product, but it's a product that can be scaled across many locations and across multiple industries as well, which I think is really interesting. So they're not going to have that. It's the opposite of vendor lock-in, isn't it? It's the buyer lock-in. Just servicing one company on what they want. This is a really good scalable product. And if I might, just another one, Tended. So Tended started with Leo is an absolutely amazing founder. He started with a £25,000 personal loan when he joined IoT Tribe, and he's taken every opportunity we've put in his way, and he's built out this really great company. His last round I think was around 5 million, and is working with I think 6 FTSE 100 companies, and it's around worker safety. So they have a device that basically, of course, now is being adapted so it can be, COVID compliant to just alert people when people are maybe a little bit too close to each other. But it's about, making sure that workers are safe in remote locations as well. So just a little bit of a plug for both of them.
Great. That's what the opportunity is for. That's wonderful. Matt, Tanya, thank you so much. Really appreciate the time and the insights.
You're welcome.
Take
Thank
care,
you.
everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.